Hi. Not long ago, I saw a story posted on Facebook about a man and his wife. It was posted as a sweet story, but I didn't view it that way. See what you think. A man married a beautiful girl. He loved her very much. One day she developed a skin disease. So slowly she started to lose her beauty. It so happened that one day her husband left for a tour. While returning, he met with an accident and lost his eyesight. However, their married life continued as usual. But as days passed, the woman gradually lost her beauty. A blind husband couldn't notice this, of course, and there was not a difference in their married life. He continued to love her, and she also loved him very much. One day the wife died. Her death brought the man great sorrow. He finished all her last rites and wanted to leave that town, presumably to make a new start. But someone said to him, "Now how will you be able to walk all alone? All these days your wife used to help you." The blind man replied, "I am not blind. I was acting because if my wife knew I could see her skin condition due to a disease, it would have pained her more than her disease. I didn't love her for her beauty alone, but I fell in love with her caring and loving nature, so I pretended to be blind. I only wanted to keep her happy." The moral of the story is, when you truly love someone, you will go to any extent to keep your loved one happy, and sometimes it is good for us to act blind and ignore one another's shortcomings in order to be happy. Beauty will fade with time, but the heart and soul will always be the same. Love the person for what she is from inside, not from the outside. Now, the moral itself sounds pretty good. Certainly beauty shouldn't be why we love others, but I find several flaws in this story. I would have thought others would see these flaws too, but when it was posted on Facebook, they didn't. I went down the list of those who commented, and every single one of them was like, "Oh, how sweet," or "What great love." But was it? I don't think so. This man lied to his wife and everybody around him. He was a dishonest person. The man forced his poor wife, who already had problems, to take care of him. I'm sure that was difficult for her. If the man had a mother, he brought great grief on her. He understood trying to make his wife feel better, but he did it at the expense of his mother and all others who loved him, including his wife, who no doubt also grieved over his loss of sight. Who provided for the family while the man pretended to be blind? Was his job something he could do while blind? Could he continue on going on his tours? Did the family go on welfare? I know blind people can work, of course, but we aren't told what this man did for a living. The man said he loved his wife for her heart, but he didn't think she was noble enough to understand that. He totally disrespected her, viewing her as a person who would prefer to have a blind husband than to worry that he might not find her beautiful on the outside. He thought his wife would prefer that he be blind than to think he didn't find her beautiful. He said he married her for a good heart, but he obviously didn't think she had a good heart. The man denied himself in a really difficult way just to make his wife feel a little better about herself. The whole thing is ridiculous. In 1905, O. Henry wrote a short story called The Gift of the Magi. The story takes place at Christmas time, and the family is poor. The husband wants to buy a nice gift for his wife, and she wants to do the same for him. The man therefore sells his beloved watch to buy combs for his wife's beautiful hair. However, the wife sells her hair to buy a chain for the man's watch. Now that's a good story. It's nice to sacrifice a possession to please someone we love, but to deny ourselves a normal life for someone else? No, we shouldn't do it, and no one should want us to do it. If the wife in the story had known what her husband was doing by pretending to be blind, she would have been outraged. This, however, is what the God of the Bible expects of us. We're to deny ourselves and give our lives over to Him. We not only lose ourselves just to Him either. Remember what they tell us we're supposed to think about in everything we do? JOY. Jesus first, others second, and you yourself last. That means we are to be more concerned about the happiness of other people than our own happiness. Now, I know this joy thing is not in the Bible, but it does say that we are to esteem others better than ourselves. And Ephesians 5:21 says we are to submit to one another. I understand that we must think of others as well as ourselves, but unlike the man in this story, we have to consider our own life first. One time I was going through a really hard time. A Christian told me that my life would be better if I thought of others rather than myself and went out and did good for them. I asked when it was my time to have good done to me. Seriously, if we don't take care of ourselves, nobody will. We must prioritize ourselves. We're supposed to follow Jesus, right? Well, he certainly put himself first. Yes, he supposedly died for us, but he was dead for maybe 40 hours or so. Anyway, we all die one way or another and one time or another. And unlike Jesus, we don't get to come back to life. Remember the story of the woman with the alabaster box of ointment who poured it all out on Jesus? His disciples, or the Pharisees, or some that were there, depending on whose gospel you read, complained about the waste of such costly perfume. Well, actually, the Pharisees pointed out that the woman wasn't a good woman, but everybody was against what happened. Jesus, however, said that it was more important for him to smell good than for the poor to be fed. He didn't say it exactly that way, but that was the gist of it. Jesus said the woman had done a good work on him and done it for his burial, and that these people would always have poor people they could help, but wouldn't always have him. So he prioritized himself. He thought making him smell good was more important than feeding hungry children. And as for the burial excuse, that's ridiculous on the surface. The purpose of putting spices and ointments on or in a dead body was to aid in the mummification process, to preserve the body. But Jesus wasn't going to be dead long enough to need that. Not to mention the fact that he was going to be beaten and bloody and lose the scent of all that expensive perfume anyway. And remember the fig tree he cursed because it didn't magically have fruit out of season just because he was hungry and wanted it to feed him? Of course, you'd think he could have made fruit on it himself, even if it was out of season, but I guess he couldn't. He got so riled that he cursed a tree, destroying nature because it wasn't magical. Jesus also had an entourage around him, 12 men who did his bidding and praised him. People even gave him their hard-earned money because we know they somehow had money, and I never heard of them working. On Supernatural, Sam and Dean Winchester always had money, but Dean was a gambler. They showed us how those boys got their money. But Jesus called fishermen, and they left their nets and followed him. So I think Jesus and his posse must have lived off others for the most part. Luke 8:1-3 says that certain women provided for him and his gang. We're told that Jesus lived a perfect life, but he didn't. If a human cursed a tree because it didn't have figs when it shouldn't have figs, we call him crazy and immature. If a human preacher accepted lavish gifts and ignored the poor around him, we condemn him. We all know that because many condemn people like Joel Osteen. Of course, I'm sure Christians would say that Jesus was a God so he didn't have to live as we do. Well, then he didn't live a perfect life as a human. He couldn't live perfectly as a human. If he had to live like we do, we see that he couldn't have done it. Not perfectly. We can't say he was the only human who lived a perfect life, which we ourselves are to emulate, and then say he didn't have to live a perfect life because he was a God. And then there's Yahweh. Christians think it's more important to stroke his big ego than to do good to other humans. And no, this is not about good and evil. I'm not saying we should steal from somebody in order to feed a hungry child. This is about making Yahweh happy. It's about worshiping him as he wants. In order to make a sacrifice, the priests Nadab and Abihu used fire that Yahweh hadn't commanded. So he sent fire himself and devoured them. In 1 Chronicles 13:7-10, Uzzah was helping to drive a cart holding the Ark of the Covenant. The oxen stumbled, and Uzzah reached out to steady the ark. But because he touched it, Yahweh killed him. These are not evil behaviors. They are simply behaviors Yahweh didn't want. There is no evil in using strange fire or touching a holy object. And Christians use these stories to impress upon us how important it is to do exactly as Yahweh says. It's more important than anything. It's more important to Christians to do what makes Yahweh say, I feel pretty, oh so pretty, I feel pretty and witty and bright, and I pity any God who isn't me tonight. Yahweh's feeling loved, Jesus smelling good, and a man's making his wife feel pretty are all apparently more important than actually doing good. Something is bad wrong with us if we think this way. Bad wrong. Imagine a mother saying to her child, I rested from my labor the day after you were born, so I expect you to rest on that day every week. And if you don't, if you say, go out and gather some sticks, I'll kill you. And that doesn't touch top, side, nor bottom of the craziness that Yahweh commands at the point of death. Again, having absolutely nothing to do with good and evil. It's outrageous. And the fact that Yahweh is God, I mean, if this were all true, it doesn't make it okay. In fact, in my opinion, it makes it worse. As I said, it's difficult for people to see that the behavior on the part of the man who pretended to be blind makes no sense, and it's not an act of love. Likewise, it's difficult for them to understand that the Bible makes no sense and it's not a book of love. In my opinion, that's because we haven't been taught critical thinking skills. If someone presents a story as being lovely, we don't know how to view it in any other way. This reminds me of Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes. I'm sure we all know that tale. It's a folk tale that's been translated into more than 100 languages. But in case you haven't heard it, here's the plot from Wikipedia. Two swindlers arrive at the capital city of the emperor, who spends lavishly on clothing at the expense of state matters. Posing as weavers, they offer to supply him with magnificent clothes that are invisible to those who are stupid or incompetent. The emperor hires them, and they set up looms and go to work. A succession of officials and then the emperor himself visit them to check their progress. Each sees that the looms are empty but pretends otherwise to avoid being thought a fool. Finally, the weavers report that the emperor's suit is finished. They mime dressing him, and he sets off in a procession before the whole city. The townsfolk uncomfortably go along with the pretense, not wanting to appear inept or stupid, until a child blurts out that the emperor is wearing nothing at all. The people then realize that everyone has been fooled. Although startled, the emperor continues the procession, walking more proudly than ever. Now, we would think this could never happen. We might say it's so silly that nobody would believe the emperor actually had on clothes, and nobody would worry about being thought to be stupid or not, for not seeing invisible clothes. But based on how people reacted to what the blind man did in the story, I think it could. I think people could be convinced of something like this. Well, in fact, I know they can. It's why we believe that donkeys and snakes can talk. It's why we can believe no one has seen Yahweh, but people have seen him. It's how we can believe Yahweh can't lie, even though we see that he does. It's why we can believe that a virgin had a baby, and that baby was the son of a God. And it's why we say Jesus lived a perfect life when we know he didn't. As you know, I could go on with this, but the main thing I want to say is that this is the reason we can believe the God of the Bible is good, even though he's arguably the most despicable character in all of fiction. Unfortunately, many of us don't know how to think for ourselves or judge truth. Again, we haven't been taught to think critically. And we need to do better. We need to recognize inconsistencies, contradictions, atrocities, and foolishness in the stories we read. Just because a bunch of words were slapped together and bound into a story or book and presented to us as truth and morally good, that doesn't make them true or good. And it for sure doesn't mean they were inspired by God. But people who, for instance, scoff at the idea of aliens, who could exist just as easily as we do. Proclaim that events happen that we know for a fact cannot happen without magic. And that's because people can't think. They can't think because they feel obligated to believe in things they know themselves are impossible. Thank you all. Bye.